Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update here on Okemo Valley TV. My name is Tom Ayers. I'm the senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper. And my guest, as always, this week is Representative Charlie Kimbell of Woodstock, representing Woodstock, Plymouth, and Reading in the Vermont State House. Hello, Charlie. It's good to see you again.
Good morning, Tom. Good to see you as well.
It's been an eventful legislative session thus far, particularly in the last 2 weeks. And once again, we return today to the topic of education, governance, and finance reform in the state, which has been the central issue before the legislature this year. H.454, a bill that proposes a massive overhaul of Vermont's education system, passed the House on Friday after 2 weeks of very substantive, well, after a whole session of substantive discussion, but particularly in the last 2 weeks. The bill passed by a bipartisan vote of 87 to 55 on Friday, and it now moves to the Senate for consideration and reconciliation between the two bodies of the legislature. So to begin with, Charlie, can you highlight some of the key points of the House version of the legislation that passed on Friday? And just to go over the key points.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a long bill at I think 156 pages. So I'll try to provide the key points as best I can. But this really takes the idea of the transformation proposal for public education that the governor had proposed in January and tries to put it into a format that is sustainable and doable, really, for lack of a better word,
Mhm.
at a pace that can be done over the next, say, 3 or 4 years. So first of that is trying to figure out what the new school district configuration could look like. And so the bill appoints five non-voting members of the Commission on the Future of Public Education, which already exists. And then there was an amendment added to the bill as part of the negotiation to get it approved through the House last week to add four legislators to that committee. And that this group of now nine is charged with presenting three different versions of what school districts could look like, aligned across historical geographic patterns or historical development patterns for schools, geography, where career technical education centers are, that kind of stuff. So that group is supposed to come back with a proposal. Um, so that's on governance. And as part of that governance, also, then the state's going to have to figure out how to create voting wards inside of those new districts. So there's proportional representation within a school district. Now, the governor proposed five districts. There's been other numbers thrown out there, say 9, 12, 20. So it could be any one of those, but it's going to be fewer than the 119 school districts we have now. So
Mhm.
so it's going to
Absolutely.
move into negotiation with the Senate, and they have their own ideas.
Yeah.
Um, so that's
Just
one big,
real quickly, let me. Um,
yeah,
so the proposal from the House is for four members of the legislature to sit on that deliberative study group over the course of the coming summer.
yeah,
If I have
yeah.
it, what will the rest of the makeup of the committee be, just for clarity purposes? Who will the other five or?
Yeah.
Um,
So there are two appointed by the Speaker of the House, two appointed by the Committee on Committees in the Senate, and one appointed by the governor. And they're supposed to be either former or retired superintendents or school business managers or somebody from a school board. So really somebody who's been in the system to know how it works, how best to kind of draw lines with the idea that
mhm,
they've been in the trenches. And so they have an idea of what those districts would look like. And then to
mhm.
have the assistance from like the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, and they can draw maps. And the maps that I've seen are pretty amazing in terms of the technology to say, show me where all the high schools are throughout the state. Show me what the facilities condition index is. What kind of shape are those schools in? Do we want to align according to the schools that are in the best shape or the schools that are on the that need the most help? So anyway, so that's and
Yeah.
then show me income, by different school districts, proposed school districts, or property wealth as measured by grand list divided by pupils. So that's all part of what
Wow.
needs to be taken into
Wow.
consideration. Yeah.
It's like it sort of sounds like legislative redistricting and overdrive
You
to
know, you're
some.
you're absolutely right. That is
Yeah,
what it is.
yeah.
And legislative redistricting is a very painstaking process that takes 2 years to go through. So,
Hmm.
we're talking about setting up the same thing. So the governor had, and this is where the governor and a lot of the Republicans differ from what the House proposal was, and that is the speed at which this is proposed to happen.
Hmm.
And then we have a very detailed timeline that we had to come up with because there are so many different effective dates that have to happen for this to be real.
Right.
And so the governor wants it a year sooner than the House thinks it's possible, just because of what you mentioned with the logistics of that redistricting.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
the second piece, we look at governance, we look at delivery, and what does that look like in terms of number of schools? And this is where there's some controversy. There's nothing in the bill that says we're going to close schools. There's nothing in the bill says that any school with a certain number are going to be closed. But there is instead an expectation of what a minimum class size should be. And to achieve those class sizes, then you have to kind of work backwards and say, we're going to need to consolidate some classrooms or consolidate some schools in order to meet those minimum class sizes. And those class sizes are set really for the benefit of the kids in terms of what has been set or what science shows is a best learning
Hmm.
environment.
Yeah.
Sometimes too small is not healthy, too large is not healthy, so you got to find where that real mix is.
Hmm.
And
And
then,
do those proposed class sizes vary across the K to 12 spectrum? Because I
does
would think there's some issues there where younger students need more.
yes,
Yeah,
no, you're right.
right.
So the governor's proposal, I believe, was K through fourth grade was going to be, and I might get this wrong without looking at my notes. K through fourth grade was supposed to be 15 per class, and then 5 through 12 is supposed to be 25 per class. So the legislature came back and in this bill said really what we're looking at now is a different class sizes so that K through 4 would be 12 students, 1 through 4 would be 15, and then grades 5 through 12 would be 18 students. I mean, that's
Okay.
sorry, I might
Yeah.
have misspoken. Kindergarten is supposed to be 12 students. There's nothing about
Right.
the size of a pre-K class. And there's also the exception for CTE programs where you need lower classes. Welding, you can't have 18 kids in a welding class.
No, obviously. Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe it's an AP English class or some kind of advanced specialized class where you don't have to meet those class size minimums.
Right. Right. So there
Um,
is flexibility built in. Yeah.
and then it has in its intent language, an intent in a bill is not binding, but it says we want to try to achieve these things through this legislation. And one of those is to look at what a typical size is for a high school. Middle school and high school should have in this bill 450 students or any kind of configuration. It could be a middle school 450, a high school 450. The governor's proposal was 650. So a lot of school districts right now are well underneath that. So
Hmm.
it's a question of, well, how do you look at that then? Is there an opportunity to combine some high schools to a more comprehensive regional high school? And so that's kind of one of the ideas being floated out there.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's governance, delivery, and also part of that delivery is a whole new thing on school construction. And I was really excited about this to have that included in the bill.
And see
Um,
that I didn't see that referenced in any of the media coverage
I know,
I've
skipped right
read.
over it. Yeah,
And I'm speaking of the major dailies in the state, and particularly Digger
yeah,
and 7 Days. None of them reference school construction as
yeah.
being part of the picture. So talk about that a little bit. How does the legislation address school construction, at least as it stands currently?
Yes, it sets up a process and it had been contemplated for a while, a process to determine what a state aid for school construction program looks like. And because since 2007, there's been no state monies to help communities build a school, whether it's a
Hmm.
elementary school, regional high school, whatever. So this tries to reestablish that state aid, but in the process is to figure out what that looks like. You know, how does it, where's the funding coming from? There's a committee appointed to come up with what standard designs might be for high schools or other level schools, and then to go through a prioritization process of what schools should be built first. Because right now we've got $6 billion in anticipated school construction projects across the state. You can't do all that at once. So you have to
Hmm.
figure out what are we going to do where. And this looks to provide 20% as a minimum towards annual debt service for these new construction projects that meet the criteria.
Hmm.
So that's 20%, an additional 20% for school construction projects that meet other criteria that might be, you know, combining two schools into one. It's a
Hmm.
concept of newer and fewer. So
Hmm.
that's in this bill. So it didn't get a lot of attention from the press. It's a pretty significant commitment. It doesn't yet have commitment of money yet, but that's also in the delivery. How are you going to have these minimum class sizes? Where the school's going to be? You know,
Hmm.
so that's part of
And,
it.
and it's particularly germane to the very communities that you represent in the House, Woodstock in particular, and Plymouth and Reading, all of which send their children to Woodstock Union High School and Middle School, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and that school's in rough shape. I mean, I went there, graduated from '82, but the building was open in 1957, and its infrastructure, its critical systems are in bad shape, and they need to be. The school really does need to be replaced.
Right, right.
Yeah,
And but all of this now is going to happen in the context of the consolidation discussions, whether Woodstock Union ultimately becomes the magnet high school for the region,
right.
or given its condition, I mean, all these variables are on the table for consideration now. So
Very much so.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And the third part of the bill is how we pay for it, and that comes out with a foundation formula. And we've spent some time talking about that in the past. And but
yeah.
this uses numbers that came from Dr. Colby and Dr. Baker, two consultants hired by the legislature to really recommend what that base funding formula should be with the appropriate weights. And so
Hmm.
that's in the bill. And that, remember, that turns everything on its head as to how we're currently doing financing. And then the third part of the financing piece, well, the second part is we create the ability for school districts to raise more money above and beyond what the base and the weights come up with. Uh, and it's called supplemental district spending. And so schools that feel like they should be spending more than what the base comes because they're not meeting the needs of their kids could do that, but subject to an approval, the voter approval.
Hmm.
And it caps it at 10% over the base, and then also then has this concept of feeding into for the property wealthy communities, then they would be feeding into a reserve that would then be dedicated to school construction. So that's another concept. The last piece is trying to come up with a way for the state to charge different tax rates between primary homes, secondary homes, and then apartments that are rented to primary home residents, and then also every other category. Right now, we just have homestead, non-homestead, and non-homestead includes everything. So this is the ability to create these tools so that you can have at least the same level of taxation between homestead and non-homestead. Um, and right now we don't have that. A lot of the communities here, we've got a higher homestead rate than we have for a non-homestead. And that
Hmm.
doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to people who live here. It's like they should at least be
Hmm.
equal. And if anything, would like to see the homestead owners, the second homeowners pay a higher rate than the non-homestead or than the homestead.
Sure.
Anyway, this bill also creates that, and that's not getting a lot of press either, but that's definitely tools that are in this bill that do create that opportunity.
Hmm. Now, that's something we've discussed a little bit in the past. This whole sort of relooking at the homestead versus non-homestead
Yeah.
issue. I know that Governor Scott is adamantly opposed to putting any extra tax burden on second homeowners, if I have that correct. Um, and there's been some division within the Democratic caucus around that issue as well. Um, so if I understand correctly, what is in the current legislation is simply creating a structure for looking at that rather than,
Yes,
yeah, right? So
you're exactly right. It creates the tools. It doesn't say what those rates are. Um, and again, the Senate might have a different idea of it, so it could come back to the House in a much different form. But
mhm,
it does create the levers. It doesn't set the rates. A future legislature would set rates if it desired to do so.
mhm,
But it does break that up. Yeah, no, Governor Scott had proposed a uniform rate across all properties, and then an exemption, a house site exemption, a homestead exemption that would give lower and moderate income residents a discount off their taxes. We found that the discount that he had proposed misses a lot of people that are currently receiving a homestead property tax
mhm,
credit, so that actually end up
mhm.
spending more. So we have a different approach to that in this bill as well. That's a homestead exemption. So I mean, it's a lot that's in here. I mean, it's
Absolutely,
so many
absolutely.
different concepts.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of the Senate, I'd like to go back to the well, we've already touched on the concerns of legislators from rural areas about the loss of local control, the potential loss of local schools through consolidation. One of the other issues that's come up in those concerns, and it's actually been addressed in public comments by the chair of the Senate Education Committee, Senator Bongartz from Bennington, is the impact that the proposed legislation that's come out of the House could have on independent schools such as Barrett
Mhm.
and Burton, St. Johnsbury Academy, Sharon Academy. Can you address a little bit of what those concerns are and how the House legislation as proposed impacts those?
Sure. The House proposal says that um, students could attend private schools as long as private schools have more than 51% of the students attending that school receiving public monies from the state.
Okay.
And they also have to meet the minimum class sizes that we're talking about. So those are two of the criteria in addition to the existing criteria they have to meet. So it was done really thoughtfully to incorporate those four historic academies, whether it's Burton, Thetford Academy, St. Johnsbury Academy, and Linden Institute. So those are the four traditional ones, but that also ropes in, I think, a couple of others, whether
Burke
it's
Mountain and Sharon, I would imagine they're sort of
well, Sharon is possible and
yeah.
would be Long Trail School, but something like Burke Mountain Academy or Deerfield, where people are sending their kids out of state, would not be incorporated, would not be included in this, where it's really a
Okay.
specialty thing. And then the bill also limits what can be paid to those schools based on what the foundation formula calculates based on that student's needs. So the question is it sufficient for that private school? Is it sufficient for public schools? It also gives students the ability to attend a public school in the state of Vermont or on the bordering states. So there are a lot of kids that are, in southern Massachusetts or in other places, southern Vermont, I'm sorry, that might attend a public school in Massachusetts because it's actually closer to their house. So that
There are
this
some
does
kids
not,
now that are attending Hanover High School.
yes, and Hanover's a special district because that's an interstate district that's created by U.S. Congress. So that's
Oh,
federally
okay.
created. Same with Rivendell up in Thetford, Rivendell
Hmm.
up in Orford,
Hmm.
New Hampshire, and Fairleigh. So yeah, there's some weird carve outs. Seth Bongart, the senator who is chair of the Education Committee, is particularly protective of Burton. It does have a tradition of it being the public high school for
Hmm.
kids in that area, as do the others. And so, in many ways, they already meet the criteria of a public school, and that really shouldn't change. I don't think you should be worried. It was intentionally crafted so that students could attend there. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next couple of weeks.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, Following Friday's vote, um, Governor Scott was quoted as, and let me take a look at my notes here. He was quoted as saying that the legislation as passed by the House was, quote, nowhere near perfect. And he indicated he would not sign it in its current state. At the same time, however, he acknowledged that the process now moves to the Senate. Uh,
Yes.
and and I implied from that that he might expect some reconciliation between the governor's version of what he thinks should happen and what comes out of the Senate. And do you have a sense of what the Senate's posture is on this right now and what kinds of areas there might be some compromise through reconciliation?
Yeah, I think the governor's concerns were, I think, mostly around the timeline. How
Hmm.
soon could we enact this education reform? And then also, and coming up with how we determine what we're going to pay for. Remember, his foundation formula was a base of 13,200, and the formula that we came up with was $15,033. That really reflects the current expenses incurred in educating students throughout the state. His is based on a future state. What would a prototypical school look like 5 years from now? And tries to impose that immediately. So that there's no way that we can get from point A to point B with the governor's formula. But I think he thinks that it's too much money that we're proposing, and that it takes too long. And from our perspective, we're really bending the cost curve in this. We've got some uh, things in the bill that really look at, say, the cost of special education delivery, which where
Hmm.
we know there are some very high and extraordinary expenses right now that could be better spent and better crafted. But we don't know what those are yet. We're really asking what the Agency of Education can do to help us in identifying what those are. So the governor has some other things that he doesn't like. And even the speed of identifying what school districts there are. And from our perspective, we really need to be thoughtful and careful about this so that we
Hmm.
don't screw it up. And so we don't want to substitute the idea of accomplishment with um, progress.
Right.
It's always
Yeah.
fun to,
Yeah.
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 Um, so, yeah, I'm not sure. Governor Scott was able to work with the Republicans in the House to say, let's get this across the finish line through the
Hmm.
House, at least to get it into the Senate, so that we can continue the conversation um, about education reform this session. And
Hmm.
so I
Hmm.
respect that. He still doesn't like all the elements of it. That's okay. And I think a better bill will come through at the end after our conversations.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Given the fact that these two study groups have been created over the course of the summer to determine the district, to make recommendations for the districts, and then to make recommendations for the voting wards. Um, uh, Given that that would be happening this summer, and assuming that the Senate approves that or some modified process thereof, when is it likely that the legislation will actually kick in reality? Um, I mean, some people would say, oh, I mean, I've already had people say to me, oh, great, another study group, you know,
Yeah, no, this is not.
yeah, one more
Yeah.
study group.
Oh,
So,
yeah, I get it. I might have shown you this before, but this is the timeline that we have.
oh,
And
wow.
so
Yeah,
it's incredibly detailed as to when things have to be decided when in order to actually have everything kick off.
right,
And they're not study groups, really. It's groups that are tasked with specific recommendations to
right,
propose
right.
to the legislature. And
Yeah, yeah,
um, so that it would be premature just to draw artificial lines. I
right.
think a lot of us feel that way because there's so many things to take into account but to have that vote, they're supposed to come back in December with a specific recommendations, and that for us to vote quickly in January on setting those up. so that we can move fast on them.
Okay.
At the same time, it sets up a group with the Secretary of State to try to start the process of establishing these political wards or political districts. And what that looks like is it has to be done by the Secretary of State's office. So that really wasn't contemplated in what we saw anyway from the governor's proposal. It's not in his bill. So that's where we're really trying to make sure we dot the i's and cross the t's there.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's yeah he's in favor of yeah continued discussions, and hopefully he'll get it to be more in line with what he'd like to see. But it took 200 years to get our school system to where it is now. We can't
Hmm.
unwind it all in 2 years.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
I do think it is worth observing at this juncture, or pointing out at this juncture, that all three of the major school uh, trade associations, administrative associations, the Superintendent's Association for Vermont, the Vermont School Principals Association, and the Vermont School Boards Association, are all on board with the House packet,
Yes.
if I understand it correctly.
Yep. They all endorsed it. And our House Education Committee worked extensively with them to come up with a proposal that would is doable in their eyes as well.
Hmm.
That would not cause just utter chaos and disruption. So it was very
Absolutely.
carefully crafted with the professionals in the field.
So what's the timeline now for this session of the legislature? It's in the Senate's hands. It's going through the reconciliation process. When is it likely to come to a final vote by both the House and the Senate, roughly speaking? I mean, you've got traditionally another month or so left in this legislative session.
Yeah.
Will it be sooner rather than later? Will it be one of the last actions taken? Do you have a sense?
Yeah, I would say late May at the earliest.
Uh-huh.
So the Senate's going to work with it, and I'm sure that we will form a conference committee of senators and House
Absolutely.
members to try to hammer out some kind of agreement and the differences. So it really depends on how fast they can move, and then bring it back to both bodies. But I mean, the governor said that he would call legislators back or wouldn't let us go home until we had this all finalized, and um, we're as focused on it, or perhaps more than what he said. So we definitely want to see this happen. So this is huge, and we know that we have a moment now in order to
Yes.
bring this across. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Any other closing thoughts on the matter before we conclude? I think we've done a fairly thorough job of covering
Yeah, I think we
the
have.
major
And
points of discussion.
you had mentioned some of the concerns of some more rural communities because for them, their small schools represent, kind of the lifeline of their communities, and I get that. And we have to be careful as to make sure that any kind of consolidation or any kind of consideration as to what schools then remain are meeting not just the needs of the community for a community center, but also the needs of the children. Uh,
Hmm.
we heard stories from folks that said there were three people in a kindergarten class. There was one high school where all the high school seniors were attending either a tech center or early college or another program. So there was only one high school senior in the entire school on campus.
Wow.
That is not a healthy dynamic.
No, not at
So
all. Not at
it's
all.
easy to think about your own rural school here and what was really attractive about it. And but when you think about the entire state and all of the kids, then you have to think, okay, we need to have a structural reform here to meet their needs too.
Right. One last point in that regard, and it's a bit of a tangent and maybe a minor point, but um, does the legislation address transportation concerns relative to consolidation? If a kid who's going to Reading Elementary School right now, and suddenly, by the formula that you've outlined, Reading may not continue to exist. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm just picking that as an example. And suddenly they're having to go 2 towns away to go to
Mhm.
elementary school, another 10 to 12 mile bus ride in the morning and in the is there some consideration being given to how much transportation issues impact the consolidation decisions?
Yeah, there's nothing specifically in the bill about transportation, but it is a consideration for that group when they're trying the new school district to
Yeah,
figure out what transportation looks like, the distance
sure.
between schools. But that's definitely that'll be a major consideration for any of the new districts too, that have more than one elementary school. And remember, the consolidation that is most interesting for people where the cost savings may be is at the high school level,
Hmm.
regional high school districts. So we're not
I
talking
see.
about Susie and Johnny in fourth grade spending an hour and a half on the bus. Nobody wants that.
Right, exactly.
And so we really, to keep elementary schools as local as possible and still be viable, I think everybody wants that. And for regional high schools and middle schools to have more options and more opportunities for the students at a bigger
Hmm.
scale. I mean,
Hmm.
that's, I think, what we're really talking about.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, Charlie, as always, it's been a pleasure speaking with you about some very complex and challenging issues related to education reform in Vermont. This will not be the last conversation we have this legislative session. Uh, in many respects, it's been the only conversation, or certainly the primary conversation we've had the last several weeks, and I'm sure that will continue in the coming weeks. But I really thank you for your time today to help explain um, what the House has put forward. We'll see how things evolve over the course of the next couple of weeks and stay on top of it with you. Uh,
Perfect.
and that's it for another edition of Legislative Update. My name is Tom Ayers, Senior Staff Writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper. My guest has been Representative Charlie Kimbell, and this program is produced each week during the legislative session in collaboration with our friends at Akimo Valley TV. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.